So today we're going to be talking about neurodevelopmental disorders. And those are basically disorders that begin in childhood and impact the child cognitively and socially. And they will follow the person all the way through adulthood and their entire lives. So last time we left off on autism spectrum disorders. And we're still on that. There's a lot to learn about autism spectrum disorders. So let's keep going. Okay. The repetitive behaviors can also affect their speech, taking the form of echolalia, in which they repeat the same sounds over and over again. Repeating the same routines without permitting any changes may be another manifestation of their disorder. Although many children prefer certain routines, for children with autism spectrum disorder, any variation in such everyday activities as getting dressed or eating breakfast can become highly upsetting. Particularly distressing to families are the disturbances that some individuals with autism spectrum disorder show in their altered sensitivity to sensory stimuli. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you. Where was I? They may seem almost impervious to pain, heat, or cold, and as a result, they can easily place themselves at risk of significant injury. On the other hand, their sensory abnormalities may take the form of hypersensitivity to noise, light, or smell, leaving them unable to withstand normal atmospheric sights and sounds. As they progress through adulthood, individuals with autism spectrum disorder face challenges in maintaining their quality of life. These challenges include impaired relationships, poorer physical health, and lower overall levels of life satisfaction and sense of meaning. One variant of autism spectrum disorder, called autistic savant syndrome, occurs when people possess an extraordinary skill, such as the ability to perform extremely complicated numerical operations almost instantaneously. So-called savant calendar calculators may, for example, be able to correctly name the day of the week for dates both in the past and for many years into the future. It appears that to perform these feats, they use certain mental shortcuts that allow them to take advantage of regularities in calendars, such as the link between dates of different months. Autistic savant syndrome typically appears at an early age, when a young child with the disorder appears to have exceptional music skills, artistic talent, or the ability to solve extremely challenging puzzles. It is possible that the tendency to focus intensely on the physical attributes of objects gives people this uncanny set of abilities. Interestingly, their memories in areas outside their areas of expertise appears to be no better than that of people with autism spectrum disorder who do not have these special memory skills. Some children with autism spectrum disorder appear to develop typically for the first 2 years, but at some point before age 10 start to lose language and motor skills as well as other adaptive functions including bowel and bladder control. This rare condition was formerly called childhood disintegrative disorder, but the diagnosis was eliminated from the DSM-5 and is now incorporated into autism spectrum disorder. In 2007, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported an estimated prevalence rate in the United States of 0.66%, or approximately 1 of every 150 children, which itself was a large increase from previously reported rates. Over subsequent years, however, the prevalence estimates have continued to increase, rising to an estimated 1 in 54 people living within 11 communities tracked throughout the United States. The reasons for this increase are not clear, though one set of Danish researchers attribute the rise, at least in their country, to changes in reporting practices. I agree. Part of the challenge in estimating prevalence is that standards for diagnosis vary considerably across studies. as do the sources of information used for establishing a diagnosis. The question is whether children are actually interviewed or the researchers use clinical summaries, in which the ratings are made from the child's records. To establish better diagnostic precision, researchers recommend using standardized instruments based on interview and observation of the child. Babe?
Yeah?
Would you mind making me a coffee, please?
Okay.
I have my mug right there. Can you use the same one? Or maybe it's outside on the table.
Outside here?
I think it's outside on the table.
Okay.
Thank you so much. To establish better diagnostic precision, researchers recommend using standardized instruments based on interview and observation of the child, rather than relying on case records. Theories and treatment of autism spectrum disorder. Evidence pointing to patterns of familial inheritance supports the theory that autism spectrum disorder is biologically based. Researchers estimate a heritability index of 0.98. The genes most likely to be implicated in autism spectrum disorder are located on chromosomes 20, 17, 8, and 2. Fascinating. And Down syndrome is chromosome 21. I crossed it out. Anyway, advances in brain scanning techniques coupled with a movement to share data among international researchers are helping to clarify possible neurological abnormalities in people with autism spectrum disorder. Some evidence suggests altered brain activity during periods of wakefulness while the individual is at rest. This pattern may indicate a deficiency in the sharing of information between the two hemispheres of the brain. Such findings are promising, but as the researchers themselves are the first to admit, they do not necessarily explain the behavioral differences associated with autism spectrum disorder. Even as research on neurological abnormalities in individuals with autism spectrum disorder is advancing, the behavioral perspective remains the most realistic and effective approach to treatment. One method found to be useful for toddlers in inclusive classrooms relies on naturalistic developmental behavior interventions, NDBI, in which teachers or other interventionists can shape the child's behavior in the course of ordinary play or instruction. For example, the teacher can increase the frequency of a target behavior, such as functional play, by establishing predictable, repeatable, and clearly defined roles appropriate to a child's developmental level. Token economies are another behavioral intervention that may produce value for some children. To be effective, the tokens themselves need to be carefully chosen to be reinforcing to the child when linked to a tangible reinforcer. Okay, so let's do what's called active reading, which is basically when you engage with the material. So what did we learn? We learned that autism spectrum disorder is linked to chromosomes 20, 17, 8, and I believe 2. 20, 17, 8, and 2. It's also saying that according to research, it looks like it's mostly an inherited gene. And it's saying that there seems to be a lot of, what is the word I'm looking for? Promising growth in younger children when they use NDIB, which is a behavior therapy. NDBI, which is basically like setting up routine even when it comes to playing to kind of like minimize the change of transitions. At least that way they know what to expect. It's also discussing that they may do something called echolalia or echolalia, which is where they constantly repeat sounds over and over and over again. They also seem to exhibit, people with autism spectrum disorder exhibit certain behaviors when they're really dysregulated, basically. Like, it seems like they don't feel pain, or it seems like they don't feel cold, and all that, which is obviously not true, but that's what it seems like in their high end state. Also, it seems like, according to research, their brain has altered is in an altered state of, I don't know if sensitivity is the word, but it's got more going on while they're awake than, people without autism spectrum disorder. And let's see. What they're trying to do to establish better diagnostic precision of autism spectrum disorder is to include behavioral examinations, which is when they watch the children, or whatever. It's usually children who get diagnosed. But I think in regards to women, I think women have been missed a lot of the time. But anyway, that's a conversation for another time. So to establish better diagnostic precision, they want to use standardized instruments based on interview and observations of the child. Okay. So another approach to intervention, one of the approaches they discussed is basically rewarding them like with tokens, but it has to be for something that they actually like. Another approach to intervention is to have peers, rather than adults, interact with the child. This situation approximates a more typical type of social environment in which children often serve a powerful role in modifying a peer's behavior. In contrast to interventions in which adults provide the reinforcement, peer-mediated interventions have the advantage of allowing children to carry on with their ordinary activities without adult interruption. In some cases, the peer interaction may take place with the exchange of pictures as the form of communication. Reinforcement may also help advance additional clinical goals not specifically within the realm of communication. For example, as adults, individuals with autism spectrum disorder do not spontaneously choose to exercise. There is evidence supporting the use of reinforcers to help instill better exercise habits. Such an approach can benefit the health of individuals with this disorder and may also improve their overall well-being. Taking advantage of new technologies, future treatments of children with autism spectrum disorder may be able to rely increasingly on such methods as virtual reality. In a 28-session virtual reality-based intervention lasting 14 weeks, researchers were able to demonstrate improved adaptation in some measures of social and emotional functioning among a community sample of children 6 to 12 years of age. This approach has been known for decades, but only relatively recently has virtual reality become more widely available. Oh, this is interesting. Okay, so they did a virtual reality-based intervention. It lasted for 4 weeks. It lasted for 14 weeks. There were 28 sessions. And basically, children with autism spectrum disorder improved socially and emotionally between the ages of 6 to 12 years old. That's interesting. That actually makes sense. Okay, let's discuss Rett syndrome. Rett syndrome is a condition in which a child develops normally early in life up to age 4 and then begins to show neurological and cognitive impairments, including deceleration of head growth and some of the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. Okay, let's read this paragraph. In Rett syndrome, the child develops typically early in life up to age 4 and then begins to show neurological and cognitive impairments, including deceleration of head growth and some of the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. The syndrome occurs almost exclusively in females. Oh, that's interesting. Although not a separate diagnosis in the DSM-5, Rett syndrome was a topic of clinical and research focus after its introduction in the DSM-IVTR. Can someone please tell me in Roman, what is a Roman numeral IV? I never got to learn Roman numerals, so I actually don't know what they are. Okay, I'm assuming it's 4, right? If DSM-5. Can you guys see me? I can't really see you guys for some reason. Let me move this. Is this better? Okay. I really am interested in this chapter, neurodevelopmental disorders, because I have ADHD. But actually, I was very surprised to learn that like the bulk of the chapter is about autism spectrum disorder, and I think it's because so many disorders fall under that clinical name. Chiquita. You guys hear my dog crying? My husband will let her in. Okay. In Rett, okay, we're discussing Rett syndrome. Clinicians who would have diagnosed children as having Rett syndrome prior to DSM-5's elimination of this diagnosis now use the autism spectrum diagnosis. However, by specifying that the children have a known genetic or medical condition, they are able to indicate that the symptoms are related to Rett syndrome. Researchers identified the gene for Rett syndrome in 1999. Mutations in this gene, which is named MECP2, lead to abnormalities in the production of a specific protein important in the normal functioning of neurons. There is hope that studies of the genes... Do you need help, babe?
No.
Okay. There is hope that studies of the genes in mouse models will prove useful in the treatment of children with this disorder. As of yet, although research is progressing on the use of psychotherapeutic medications... Thank you, my love.
Careful, it's hot.
Thank you. None have passed clinical trials. Okay, so there's no medication for it, for what was previously known as Rett syndrome, which is now under the autism spectrum disorder. I think it's important for me to tell you guys, like when it comes to autism spectrum disorder, very recently they have moved a lot of disorders to be under the autism spectrum disorder. Okay, so there are going to be like different types of symptoms. I'm not exactly sure why they've moved everything. I think that's a great question actually to ask either to ask my professor or to just figure out myself. Why so many disorders move to autism spectrum disorder? Okay. High-functioning autism spectrum disorder, formerly called Asperger's disorder. As we pointed out earlier, Asperger's disorder is not in the DSM-5. Its symptoms continue to define the high-functioning end of the autism spectrum, and therefore, although not part of the nomenclature, is it nomenclature or nomenclature?
I think it's closer.
Although not part of the nomenclature, it is worth its own coverage here. Okay, Google, define nomenclature.
Here's the definition of nomenclature: the devising or choosing of names for things, especially in a science or other discipline.
Thank you. Asperger's disorder is named after Hans Asperger, a Viennese physician who during World War II described a group of boys who possessed rather good language and cognitive skills, but had marked social problems because they acted like pompous little professors and were physically awkward. Can I just say, as someone with a neurodevelopmental disorder myself, I find a lot of the stuff that they say to be like rude. Because to me it seems normal. Okay. Anyway, let me not take it personal. Indeed, high-functioning people on the autism spectrum have less severe and more focused impairments than their lower-functioning counterparts, perhaps showing their symptoms only after they reach preschool age. At that point, when most children develop social and interactive skills, these children have difficulty reading the social cues of others and taking turns talking, and they are unable to interpret language subtleties. Early in their lives, they tend to become preoccupied with a narrow set of interests about which they may talk extensively, not realizing that such one-sided conversations are not socially appropriate. Literally, that was me my whole life. However, they are more likely than children at the lower functioning end of autism spectrum to try to make friends. Okay, now we're going to read a real story. Actually, I think I'll come back to that. I have to read a whole chapter today, so I will come back to the real stories case studies, whatever, if I have time. So I'm going to mark it with a Post-it. In one fascinating case described in the literature, Volkmar, an 11-year-old boy, Robert, had the verbal abilities of a 17-year-old, but the social skills of a 3-year-old. Although Robert had remarkable knowledge of the stars, planets, and time, his exclusive intellectual devotion to these subjects kept him from acquiring other kinds of knowledge. Peers rejected him because of his one-sided and naive overtures. His case highlights the complex nature of autism spectrum disorder for individuals at the high-functioning end of the continuum. The disrespect that they're putting on our name. I'm not autistic, but I just... It's fine. In the early years of the child's life, parents are more likely to view him or her as especially gifted rather than as suffering from a serious impairment. As the children get older, their problems become more prominent, and it is then that parents and educators may seek to intervene. Whether called Asperger's or not, the form of autism spectrum disorder that includes higher levels of functioning can be one with which individuals learn to cope and even thrive. Career planning in this regard is particularly important, taking into account people's strengths and the demands of potential employment positions. For example, if they have the aptitude, they would seem well suited for careers in fields such as science and engineering, in which their intensity can lead to success in research and development. In addition, as adults, they may be able to gain considerable self-insight into their strengths and weaknesses as they also learn to acquire social skills. Okay, so let's go over what we learned. What we learned is that high-functioning autism spectrum disorder, it was formerly known as Asperger's disorder, and basically they seem like they're very gifted, but once they start school, they start having trouble with social cues, and let's see, what else does it say? Social and interactive skills. And they have narrow interests, and I guess that is called